Hello my good chums. Today I will be sharing with you what I know about the Spire of Stars raid. This is going to be a tentative guide video for best strategy and all secrets with a heavy grain of salt because after only a day or two, it's unlikely we know everything there is to know. The entire raid layer builds up on mechanics that will be important to keep in mind throughout the encounters. First and foremost, this launcher here spits out a purple ball that needs to be passed from teammate to teammate. Familiarizing yourself with the ball's arc trajectory and sightlines is going to be very important in every encounter, but as a general rule, aim at the very top of whatever you're throwing the ball at, but not above it. Watch how I hit this central brazier, for instance, as I prep the first encounter. The goal of the first part of the raid layer is to stay alive long enough to activate the central brazier 3 more times. In order to accomplish that, you just need to survive the adds while ensuring none of the 4 outlying braziers go unattended. The outlying braziers correspond to the 4 plates with smoky wisps next to them, and to prevent each of those braziers from extinguishing, players will need to stand on the associated plate. Any of the braziers can wipe your team, so it's important to keep the eye on the flames. Generally speaking, it's best to keep a set rotation for the ball so no plate goes ignored. But always be on the lookout for any flames that have turned red, because that means that plate needs the ball immediately. Also, the higher the blue flames, the longer the plate can go without the ball. You can see the flames rising as the plate does when you stand on it. Once the plate is risen fully, it's best to pass the ball and get off the plate immediately. There's no point in standing on the plate if your flames are in good shape. In shortest possible form, the objective is to prevent any outlying brazier flames from turning red. This sounds simple enough, but the catch is that standing in the smoke, which is on the plate, without the ball, will give players an engulfed debuff. Engulfment will kill the player 15 seconds after they're affected if they do not hold the ball. If the player holds the ball after standing in the smoke, they will get a new debuff, Greed. That kills you if it rises above 10 stacks. Greed will continue to grow as long as the player holds the ball after having touched smoke with it. All in all, to avoid being killed by engulfment, players need to hold the ball before or shortly after touching the smoke. At the same time, players will have to hold past the ball to prevent their own greed from building up too much and to help their teammates maintain their braziers. Basically, you want players to throw the ball in a circle so the plate holders can keep their flames happy and healthy until the ball can be thrown at the central brazier. Our strategy for this section was to have 3 players closer to spawn, 1 on each close plate and 1 floating, 3 players farther from spawn, 1 on each far plate and 1 nearby the ball's spawn launcher. The job for each of these roles is pretty simple. Each player designated to a plate should always be in a position to catch a throw from the previous ball holder in their rotation, and from that position they should kill as many adds as they can safely. Killing adds in this section is not necessary, so players may as well be conservative if they need to. Plate holders need to focus on their brazier and bring attention to it if it turns red. The floater should position themselves near whatever player in the team is struggling most with adds. I would suggest either between the 2 close plate holders or next to the ball launcher with the other non-plate holder. This will probably depend on your team's power levels, but the floater should almost always be shooting something. Additionally, Centurions, Gladiators, and Colossuses will spawn in at fixed intervals just before the central brazier's shield lowers, and the floater player should always be prepared to spend power ammo on those extra dangerous adds to kill them quickly. Finally, the player near the ball launcher just needs to ensure that the ball stays in rotation. After each attack on the central brazier, a new ball will spawn, and it's up to the player to bring it back into the rotation as fast as possible. This job is really easy to forget amongst all the ad shooting, so it's probably best to designate a strong player to it, otherwise falling behind becomes much more likely and that will lead to a wipe. Our plate throwing rotation was far left, far right, close right, then repeat from the start, or more simply, counterclockwise. Following this rotation, or any other consistent rotation of all 4 plates, makes it easy to know where to throw the ball next, and it keeps the braziers evenly maintained. If your team gets that down, you should live long enough for the central brazier's shield to lower, which you can see in the text feed at the bottom left with the shield lowered message, at which point you can throw the ball at it to progress the encounter. Once the central brazier has been hit, the player near the ball's spawn launcher needs to throw it back to one of the players on a plate so the rotation resumes and the outlying braziers are kept in check. If your team can do that 3 times, you win. This is a relatively simple encounter in practice, but it's a very good encounter designed regardless because it helps to build familiarity with mechanics that you'll need to know throughout the other segments. If a player doesn't know how greed and engulfment work in the final boss fight, it's a guaranteed extra death or 2 that you can easily avoid by learning the first encounter. To elaborate, I'd like to stop and mention 2 major tickets for an easy ride on the struggle bus. 1. Engulfment. Players get engulfment by standing in smoke without the ball. Therefore, players should absolutely avoid the smoke unless they intend to be in it. If someone accidentally gets an engulfment debuff, they will need to have the ball thrown to them to prevent death, and in practice, that can create enough confusion to cause an unnecessary struggle with resetting the rotation, a death, or a wipe. The smoky areas throughout the raid are important and need to be respected. Do not wander near them without a good reason. 2. Greed. Players get greed stacks when they hold a ball that has touched smoke. The first section of the raid layer actively encourages you to throw the ball away before your greed could build up enough to kill you, but if a greed stack goes above 10, you will die. You can't idly hold the ball while you wait for a teammate to get in a position for too long. If your greed gets close to 10, throw the ball away as close to a teammate as you can. It's better to throw it on the ground and call that out than it is to die of greed. In other words, just because the ball saved you from being engulfed does not mean that you are safe. Once you're holding the engulfed ball, you have to keep an eye on your greed stacks. Don't let yourself forget about them. Also, greed does not decay immediately after you've thrown the ball. And every time you pick up an engulfed ball, you'll get a stack of greed immediately. So while throwing it on the ground to slow your stacks does work, it can't be used to totally prevent buildup. And if you pick up a ball while your stacks are at 10, expecting to immediately throw it, you'll just die, so don't do that. However, this is great for trolling your teammates if they call out that they're at 10 greed. Take advantage of it if you can. These two lessons should absolutely be learned before making serious attempts at the final boss. Keep them in your mind always. The second encounter is the Power Conduit, the Spire of Stars resident jumping puzzle. This section doesn't have any mechanics, bar those required for a hidden chest I'll explain in just a second, but it does require quite a few long and high jumps, so high mobility could help players who struggle in these sections, and hunters should almost certainly have triple jump selected. The goal of this section is simply to reach the end, which will require at least 3 players to reach every control panel. The lever is only accessible if 3 players are close enough to it. The jumping section starts with one easy to reach lever, and from there, players will have to jump on a series of slowly rotating panels up and down the conduit. At each checkpoint, which can be identified by its glowing orange window on a stationary structure, 3 players will have to arrive to activate the bridge to the next section. There are 3 total checkpoints. Since these sections tend to separate players from their teammates quite a lot, it's fairly common to have players waiting for a third of the checkpoint. If you're a Titan, this can be an excellent opportunity to shoulder charge a teammate out of the window to their death, so look out for those opportunities. Stay vigilant.
That's too low.
Yeah, okay. You know, I knew it was coming. And
You can try
Red V. Like, maybe he's grown up in the past 2 days. Nope. No, he's just...
Red V, man.
I think it should be noted at this point, for some reason, the revolving panels will sometimes just eat your character's ability to double jump. I can only assume this is a bug, but frequent deaths in this section aren't always the player's fault. The first secret chest can be found by jumping up in the second control panel checkpoint room through a hidden upper window. From there, only a few more panels need to be jumped across before the chest can be seen on a high stationary platform. The chest should be easy to find from the second checkpoint. However, the second hidden chest is an actual loot drop and can be a bit more complicated. To access it, a ball needs to be acquired at the very beginning of the jumping section before the first bridge. From the first room, with the very first 3-person requiring lever, if you take a right as you leave, there's a smoke triangle on the ground with an offset but otherwise inconspicuous ledge. Looking directly up from the triangle, there are 2 grates that can be shot and destroyed. Once those grates are out of the way, look closely at the support beam on the way back to the main path. On the side opposite the one with the emblem, there is a rectangular power box situated a good ways up from the support beam that can be shot and destroyed. It's pretty hard to see, but if you know what to look for, you won't miss it. Once this box is destroyed, the ball will spawn, and so begins the fun. The ball needs to be taken all the way to the end of the jumping puzzle, as you balance greed stacks with your teammates. This is the first section of the raid where players encounter deliberately engulfing the ball and stacking greed for no reason other than to have an engulfed ball. If you have the ball and your greed stacks aren't building, you'll need to take it to one of the smoky wisps to make it useful. It can't activate anything if it's not engulfed. The easiest way to overcome this platforming challenge is to set your teammates up in advance so that you can easily pass the ball without having to manage both platforming and greed stacks simultaneously. At the very least, you can save your teammates a headache by waiting in the checkpoint windows, which mercifully also act as a checkpoint for the ball's progress. I would have liked to struggle like this with no checkpoints, but in fairness, I guess this is a raid layer with an adequate difficulty level. Yeah, adequate. Anyhow. Figuring out the easiest path for throws is very simple for the first 2 checkpoints. The first can be done on a basic ground level the whole way, and you can actually throw the ball all the way from the first checkpoint directly to the second checkpoint, but the third checkpoint is a bit difficult to navigate. This is definitely the pain point where if you don't set up a simple line of tosses for your team, you're going to struggle. If push comes to shove, just remember, YOLO, Kobe it, easy.
I tried to get as far as I could.
Yes! Come on!
I got it!
Get in there, Dom! For the love of God! Again, this chest is an actual loot checkpoint, and you can get the sidearm, fusion rifle, emblem variants, or armor pieces from it, so for the experience alone, it's worth a little extra effort at least once. Once you've gotten your full team through the power conduit into the giant closed doorway, it will open to reveal a large giant cylinder in the middle of the room. There are 4 more of the destructible power boxes at the base of the cylinder that, once destroyed, take you to the penultimate encounter. Once your team has arrived in the Celestial Observatory, you should make note of the room's layout. There are 7 plates that are very important in this encounter. 4 big spread out plates and 3 central smaller plates. At the center of the room on the highest platform, there's an energy elevator that activates if all 4 big plates are held. And on the lower level of the center of the room, there are 3 closed doors that open if all 3 smaller plates are held. Knowing when to activate each set of plates is extremely important. Big plates are to send scouts and engulfed ball-armed players to space. Small plates are to arm the weapons to destroy the ships. This will make more sense as I explain the encounter, but for now, it should be noted that the 3 small plates are distinct from one another, unlike the big plates. The small plates have unique weapons designated to them, so we tell them apart by the outline on the plate: circle, square, and triangle. Respectively, these are the center, left, and right plates. It's also worth noting that the far back wall has 4 ball spawn launchers, each associated with one of the big plates. These launchers will light up before a ball is thrown into the room, so you can tell which plate a ball is going to land on before the icon even shows up. Additionally, there are 3 smoky triangles on the ledges above the small plate's doorways. These are the locations you will need to go to engulf the balls before arming the weapons or destroying the ships. To complete this encounter, you need to destroy all 3 of Kaor's ships in space. This requires 3 phases: scouting, arming, and destroying. These phases will be used again in the final boss fight, so mastering them at this stage will be very helpful. Let's start with phase 1. The first phase is called scouting because a player needs to be sent to space but can't yet do anything other than determine which weapon to arm. After all 4 players designated to the big plates are on them, the energy elevator can be used by any player with the superior retainer buff, which is randomly given to 3 players during the scouting phase. If it so happens that all 3 players who get superior retainer are designated to plates, then someone will have to take one of their places, because going up the energy elevator without superior retainer buff will kill you. Moving forward, the player with the superior retainer buff goes into the energy elevator and rides it into space. As soon as that player is taken out of the zone, the other players can step off their plates. They don't need to be on them the entire time someone is in space. Meanwhile, the superior retainer relays to their team what they see. One ship will be labeled with a circle, triangle, or square outline icon, and that icon determines which weapon needs to be armed. Going forward, I'm going to call players with the superior retainer buff empowered, because when calling things out saying I'm superior sounds kinda tacky, but it's an important thing to communicate to your team, so we took to saying I'm empowered like an axis. Empowerment will change every ship cycle, so it's important to pay attention to it throughout the encounter. Once the empowered player has identified the ship's icon, the scouting phase is effectively over. In fewer words, this entire phase requires 4 players to stand on big plates while 1 player goes into the elevator to see which weapon needs to be armed. So begins phase 2. To arm the correct weapon, players will have to stand on all 3 of the small plates. Once all 3 small plates are held, a player will need to throw an engulfed ball into the door with the icon corresponding to the scouted ship. You can tell that it worked if the text feed reads X weapon armed. Simple as that. However, this is probably the single most dangerous phase of the entire lair. Legionaries will spawn with Cabal shotguns, which will absolutely melt you if you stay on any of the small plates too long. Also, if a player forgets to engulf one of the balls before they throw it into the arming deposit, it will force a wipe. So you can't forget to step on one of the smoky triangles above the doors if you're the one throwing the ball. Phase 2 can be completed very quickly, and it should. Holding the small plates is dangerous, especially if you're underleveled. Team coordination is key here. Don't dilly-dally when it's small plate time. If, at any point during phase 2, the braziers in the background begin to have red fire, you are running very low on time to complete the objective and need to hurry up, my doggies. Particularly in phase 2, you'll be locked out of the door a few seconds after those fires run red. Time is of the essence here. Immediately after the weapon is armed, Colossuses or Centurions will spawn. They should be killed before moving on to phase 3 because standing on the big plates with them alive is a huge risk. Once the Colossus or Centurion is dead, you can move on to phase 3, destroying the ships. Assuming the correct icon was scouted and the corresponding correct weapon was armed, it's time for the 4 big plates to be activated again. An empowered player needs to collect and engulf a ball before taking it into space where they can throw it at the vulnerable ship, destroying it. Again, this is a phase where you can't forget to engulf the ball, and you have to send an empowered player to space. Coordinating and remembering everything can be tricky, but this is the easy part relatively speaking. Repeat the entire process 3 times and you beat the encounter. To provide a quick recap that summarizes what needs to be done, activate big plates to send a scout to space, then activate small plates to arm the weapon corresponding to the scouted icon, then activate big plates again to send the empowered player back to space with an engulfed ball to destroy the ship. It's a lot of mechanics to tackle and you can easily get lost if you don't pay attention, but once you get into the rhythm of it, the bigger threat will definitely be the ads. Our strategy for the first Celestial Observatory encounter involved designating 4 players to specific plates. I would suggest the farthest plates go to the strongest players, as those plates are more vulnerable to adds. Once the 4 plates are designated, you have selected 2 floater players by default. These 2 players should stick to either the right or left side of the room to form an even 3-3 split of players in the left and right of the room. The floaters are always priority for scouting, as it won't require anyone to take their position elsewhere. Again, in the unfortunate circumstance that all 3 empowered players are plate holders, one of the empowered players will have to temporarily swap places with a floater so that someone can go to space. Those positions would only need to be swaps for the duration of that ship cycle. Throughout the section, players should only activate plates if they are needed. Appointing a shot caller for when to step on what plates is invaluable. When plates aren't needed, players should generally position themselves in the room on the left or right of spawn, because that is much safer than being forward on the plate behind cover, or with no cover. For the arming phase, we'd further divvied up our team into groups of 2, 2, and 2, so that each small plate could be securely defended. The right and left plates will take harsher punishment than the central one, and the doors will open immediately if all 3 plates are stood on. This part is best completed by clearing the adds and communicating if it's not safe to get on your plate yet. Once the plate is safe to stand on for a few seconds, everyone should hop on, and a player selected to carry the engulf ball should throw it into the correct weapon deposit. Because the ball can be thrown to any of the 4 plates, it will likely vary who the best holder is for arming weapons. It should be noted that throwing the ball to arm the weapons does not require empowerment. You only need to stay on the plates for a very short time, so in a pinch, it's possible for the ball holder to stand on the plate and activate it even if nobody else is defending it. The final section, the Coer boss fight, is without a doubt the most demanding encounter in the raid lair. As such, I'm going to once again explain general knowledge, my team's strategies, and then perhaps most importantly, lots of quick tips that could save the day for your team. If you're skipping forward to this section, I'd advise you at least watch the previous encounter section, because everything I say about that encounter is going to be used again here, and I'm going to gloss over it in this section for the boss fight so as to not repeat myself. Coer's boss fight has 7 phases excluding ad clearing. 3 of those phases are souped up versions of a previous encounter, and the other 4 range from somewhat to completely new. The end goal of the section is, obviously, to kill Coer, and to accomplish that, you'll need to destroy his fleet and turn his white mechanic against him to make him vulnerable to damage. As always, we're starting with phase 1. The very first phase of Coer's boss fight is straightforward ad clearing. Using the roles designated in the previous encounter, 4 players on big plates and a floater player on either side, enemies should be cleared to the best of your ability, focusing on any Centurions. After a certain period of time, Coer's corruption will overtake him and engulf the entire raid team as an engulf ball is lobbed into one of the big plates. To tell when this phase is about to start, you can listen for an audio cue or simply watch Coer begin to double over himself and glow purple. Remember when I mentioned that you could see the 4 ball launchers in the back of the room? This is where you want to pay attention to them as they light up, because it can really help you to prepare to pick up the ball immediately, which you'll want to do because all 6 players need to touch it within 15 seconds of it landing. If a player is out of position and not paying attention, this chaos can result in a death, especially if you are on the later phases of the fight and tensions are starting to rise. Depending on which side the ball lands on, right or left, you'll probably want to throw strictly from left to right or right to left, and ensure that you're making noise if you need the ball and your team hasn't seemed to notice that. After all 6 players have touched the ball, it can be safely thrown at Coer to dispel his corruption. This can be trickier to aim than it might seem, so be prepared to run to his plate and pick it up and throw it again if needed, but if the ball spawns, that's okay. You can get a second chance at the process before it wipes you. Shortly after Coer has been hit by the ball, gladiators will fly in on drop pods onto each of the 4 big plates. Anticipate that by not standing on the plate unless you want to look like an idiot. Once the gladiators are killed, the new phase is done and the fight essentially reverts back to the previous encounter. Next comes the scouting phase, arming phase, and ship destroying phase, but as I said before, each of these phases will have twice as much to do. You can still designate a single player to a scout since they can easily relay twice as many icons, but 2 players will be needed to throw a ball to arm a weapon, and 2 ships will need to be destroyed. Both of these phases offer some wiggle room for recovery. If a ball thrown to arm a weapon doesn't work, which seems to happen some of the time regardless of aim, you have enough time to engulf another ball and try again with the process. If both ships aren't destroyed by their first engulfed ball for whatever reason, there's time to recover for a second try. However, failing any of these mechanics twice results in a wipe that cannot be avoided. Same as the previous fight. If any of the braziers' flames turn red, you are running low on time. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this section because it's essentially the same as the previous encounter with double the mechanical demandingness. After destroying both of Coer's ships, a ball will be lobbed into the arena. This ball should be immediately picked up and engulfed by whoever is nearest to it, because the next ball won't come in until the first has been engulfed long enough. After a while, the second ball will spawn in and it should be picked up and engulfed immediately as well. Throughout this phase, players will essentially need to hot potato the ball amongst themselves so that nobody dies from greed until the third and final ball arrives. It takes 3 players to cycle one ball effectively, so managing the ball here is actually a little bit difficult if you don't do it pretty well. You can't throw it back and forth between 2 players alone, it will cause problems. Once the third ball has arrived and is engulfed, it should only be moments longer before Coer begins to magically levitate the mechanical corpse of Robot Callus. Once Callus has been lifted to full height, he will raise his arm, as in Robot Callus will raise his arm, and it will grow purple. This is your cue to throw the engulfed balls at Robot Callus. The window is relatively short, so if you don't pay attention to when Robot Callus is being lifted, you may be too late. You can also tell if a throw was too late, because the ball will harmlessly bounce off Callus instead of exploding. If all 3 engulfed balls do successfully land, Coer will stagger and the DPS phase will begin. Of course, Coer takes this opportunity to fire back. During the DPS phase, Coer fires volleys of homing missiles that will instantly shred targeted players. 2 missiles come out at a time following a single player, and he seems to target mostly randomly. The missiles can be shot down, but fighting him with that threat is very risky. This is when you want to be shooting him, not keeping yourself safe. So I suggest hiding in the far back left and right rooms, and far back in those rooms to boot. Until you've died to these missiles, I think it's hard to appreciate the danger they represent. Coer's weak point is the canisters on his back. Just like any Incendiar Cabal, but seemingly a little less generous. It's much easier to land your critical shots if he isn't facing you. The DPS phase is relatively short, but it's long enough to fire off all of your heavy ammo if you prepare for it properly. It should also be noted that if he's looking at you, watch out for fire, because he'll put spots on the floor, and if you stand in one for very long, you'll get weak enough to be killed by other sources of damage pretty easily. After the DPS cycle ends, the fight starts over from the beginning minus some portion of his health and 2 ships in the fleet. There are 3 possible damage phases. After the third, he will enrage and wipe the team if you haven't depleted his health. But if you do deplete his health, he's got a final stand that's guaranteed to wipe you if you don't expect it. After Coer's health bar reaches 0, his canisters explode, engulfing all players and releasing a flurry of balls into the arena. Every player should get 1 ball from the first set. Do not be greedy for DPS or you will kill your teammates. The damage numbers from the balls thrown at him don't actually count as boss damage, and the new balls stop spawning in if players start dying. And weapons barely put a scratch on his shield. For reference, one of my ball hits did 396,000 damage, and a sleeper body shot did 16,000. That means 1 ball is worth about 25 times as much as a sleeper shot. To be perfectly clear, you can throw multiple balls, some will spawn in behind his platform after the first set, but no player on the team should ever try to take more than 1 ball from the first set or their teammates will die of engulfment. If someone is grabbing all of the balls thinking they're helping, they are actually wiping you. Do not fight to throw balls from the first set. As for our team's strategies throughout the whole encounter, a lot of the positioning and gameplay bleeds over from the previous phase. Some particular notes include that attention needs to be paid during the first phase, so throwing the engulfed ball to all 6 players within 15 seconds is straightforward. Our team all rallied at our spawn point of the room in a single file line to achieve that, which can also be done for the 5th hot potato phase. Basically, if all the team is focused on throwing the ball, we would fall back to spawn. Additionally, more so than the previous encounter, it is important to have a player shot calling where to stand on plates. Of course, you'll need to designate 2 empowered players for ship destroying as well, so role designation is much more complicated. Perhaps most importantly, our team found that splitting up during the DPS phase was an effective way to shoot his weak point by making him turn away from the players. I think the best setup for DPSing the boss would be to have 3 players at the back of the far back rooms, 3 on the left and 3 on the right, as this spot is safe from his missile attack but still has good sightlines to shoot him. I think the best weapon for this fight is probably Sleeper Simulant, but Darcy, Skyburner's Oath, and a good shotgun are all strong options as well. Beating his final stand will become much easier as our light levels increase, I'm sure, but for now, that requires everyone in the fire team to have a good grasp of what they need to do once it happens. Congratulations if you managed to beat this boss, by the way. It certainly seems like the best boss we've ever had in Destiny, and it's certainly the most challenging for the time that it came out. I'm going to make a commentary video talking about why I like each of the sections and what could be improved as well, so feel free to let me know your thoughts about that on Twitch or Twitter, because I'm not about to read YouTube comments after, like 1 hour of the upload, just being honest here. Finally, let's get into very specific tips in no specific order. All of these have the potential to save you from causing a wipe. The greed mechanic can be slightly put off by throwing the ball at the floor and picking it up again. The diamond-shaped explosion timer on a dropped ball fills up just slowly enough that you can lose 1 greed stack before picking it up again. However, this cannot be repeated twice. If you pick up the ball yourself after dropping it on purpose, throwing it at the ground again does not refresh the explosion timer, so it will resume from wherever it left off, exploding quickly if you did that to lose a stack of greed. In other words, you can drop the ball on purpose to delay your greed buildup by a few seconds once, but you can't do it twice in a row. on the second throw, it needs to go directly to another player's hands. The strategy can be applied to giving the ball to another player as well. Throwing it at the ground and having someone else pick it up seems to reset the timer, so you can extend the time you hold balls by doing that. Generally speaking, you can't do anything with the balls unless they are engulfed. It should be a habit to engulf the ball immediately at any point you have it, unless you can tell your team isn't ready for that. For instance, if gladiators are still alive and you know your team can't reasonably hold on to the 4 big plates safely yet, always engulf balls before using them, but don't rush if you don't need to. As one final note on the greed mechanic, I would recommend against delaying your own timer in an uncoordinated team, because if you don't have anyone to pass it to when your greed hits 10, you'll have to throw it randomly and then it's going to explode if you've wasted the timer. Establishing who is taking the ball next in advance is pretty important. Coer's fire spots do a ton of damage and can force retreats if they hit hard enough. It's very important to keep moving all the time in the fight so you never wind up standing in one spot for too long, because if he fires at you while you're inactive, it'll hurt a lot. However, the fire spots are relatively small. If you are able to make a deliberate effort to stand on the edges of one of the plates, you can almost always safely continue standing on the plates as he fires at you. Even 3 spots of fire on a plate still leaves enough room for you to safely handle his shots if you manage it well. Coer will almost always try to slam the ground when a player goes through the energy elevator. As a result, during the ship destroying phase, when 2 empowered players need to use the lift, the 2 players should go at the same time or at a significantly staggered time. If the first player goes through and baits the melee response from Coer and the second player gets in the lift right as the melee happens, the second player will take a lot of damage. If you're the second player in this situation, you need to be aware of the threat of his melee. Whether it was aimed at you or not, it's still predictable. During the DPS phase, the homing missiles Coer files at you are absolutely nutty. If you are DPSing from the back of one of the safe rooms and get near the doorway, it's possible to die before there is any chance to respond to it. Unless you plan on actually dealing with the missiles by shooting them, I would strongly advise just staying at the back of the rooms. Also, he tends to fire one last volley of missiles right as his shield comes back up, so rushing outside instantly after the DPS phase can get you killed. Don't do that. The very beginning of the DPS phase is the best opportunity to apply debuffs like Tractor Cannon or Melting Point to Coer. It's also the easiest time to land a Golden Gunshot or Nova Bomb. Basically, as soon as his shield comes off, that's when you want to hit him with your hard-hitting supers. During the rest of the DPS phase, he will either be attacking you or turning unpredictably. For gladiators, I like to bank shots with Sleeper Simulant and one-shot them, which I know can be done with a power level as low as 368 for certain, just about as soon as they spawn in. However, their spawn is different from every other drop pod in the game. They will only be vulnerable to damage after the pod has almost completely disappeared, as opposed to immediately after it has landed. Don't try to damage them until you can see them. Occasionally, and unfairly, they will have begun to move before they should be vulnerable. Be prepared for that possibility. On that note, both gladiators and flanks represent a threat beyond their intended damage. Physics. Always assume a melee from either of those enemies will one-shot you, because if they hit you and you bonk into a wall, there's a good chance you'll die. During the final boss fight, these are the most important enemies to shoot first, because any space they occupy is unsafe to occupy until you've killed them. If it seems like staying on your plate is going to get you killed, call out that you need to get off, and try to give people an idea when you can get back on, so they know if they should get off their plates too. It doesn't make any sense to stay on the plate and die, because at that point you aren't holding the plate anyway. The final fight, particularly if you're underleveled, is long enough and dangerous enough that using your revive tokens sparingly is pretty important. When it comes to callouts, using left, middle, and right plates is probably the simplest way to be understood between any team you play on. Left plate has a square outline, center plate has a circular outline, and right plate has a triangle-ish outline. Whether there are 2 players who need to use engulfed balls during weapon aiming or ship destroying, always try to prioritize engulfing the ball on the left or right before the center. That way, the other player will never have to go all the way across the center. Use the raid gauntlets with the raid mod that grants the possibility of power ammo drops on melee kills. The only orange bar enemies throughout the encounter are Centurions and Gladiators, and if you can only expect to kill 2 of those per phase, you can expect yourself to run out of power ammo. Of course, you should seek to put a shot into any orange bar enemy anywhere in the arena before it dies, but the raid gauntlets are the only reliable way to ensure you won't run out. As with all raids, if you've already had a few deaths, be very clear that someone needs to pick up the next fallen teammate. If you're next to a dead teammate but don't have a revive token, you need to say so, because otherwise your teammates will assume you've got it. Don't force someone to run across the room with 3 seconds on the clock because of a bystander effect. Well, that's it. I sure hope that sums up everything nicely enough. I tried to make this as all-inclusive of a guide as I could. Here's hoping the next raid is just as good as this one, and that Bungie manages to make loot a hell of a lot more interesting in the meantime. Like I said before, I hope to put out a commentary video on this as well, because I have a lot to say about this raid lair. I think it's probably the best piece of content we have ever seen in Destiny 2, to be perfectly honest. Thanks for watching, buds. Also, follow me on Twitch. Going up. Hold on, plate.
Yeah, dude, you just debated me. You literally just debated me. I'm not even kidding. You just baited me real hard. I was not.
Oh my god.
I'm going to check. You literally got me so bad. I'm mad. Alright, I'm going up, boys.